Okay, chapter 11. It's a little bit long, so bear with me. On the night of April 22nd, after another night's delay, John Wilkes Booth and David Harold finally climbed aboard a boat and rowed into the Potomac toward Virginia. This time they steered the correct course and, after several hours, spotted their destination, the mouth of a creek on the Virginia side of the Potomac. They landed and disembarked. At last, on April 23rd, 9 days after the assassination, John Wilkes Booth and David Harold set foot on Virginia soil. Their contact, a former Confederate agent, Mrs. Quinsonberry, had a place about a half an hour away on foot. Booth's injured leg made the brief walk impossible for him, so Harold went alone to find the woman. Elizabeth Quinsonberry, an ex-Confederate spy, was cautious when Harold approached her. Experience during the war taught her to be suspicious of strangers, especially those who looked like Harold. Harold revealed that Thomas Jones had sent him to her, which put her mind at ease. Harold revealed the nature of his request for help. He was traveling with an injured companion. They needed horses to make their way south. Suspecting or already knowing who the two strangers were, Mrs. Quinsonberry decided that this was too big a job to handle by herself. With the help of other loyal operatives, she arranged for horses. She would get the two moving south as quickly as possible. Speed was now of the essence. Mrs. Quinsonberry arranged for horses and food, which Harold brought to a waiting Booth. After eating, they saddled up and rode to Dr. Richard Stewart's house. Dr. Richard Stewart's house was the next stop on their journey. To their dismay, the doctor refused to help them. Harold pleaded their case, mentioning that their Confederate credentials and the recommendation from Dr. Mudd. Stewart, unconvinced and suspicious of the elaborate and ridiculous cover story Harold spun for him, reluctantly offered to feed them. After eating, they would have to be on their way. Dr. Stewart was a great disappointment, failing to display the Southern hospitality and honor that Booth had come to expect. Booth and Harold sat down to dinner with the Stewart and his family. How out of place these dirty, tired travelers must seem at the Stewart's fine table. But Booth's filthy clothes, unshaven face, and pungent body could not conceal his obvious good breeding. His excellent manners, educated voice, and physical poise marked him as a gentleman. But by now, Stewart knew exactly who his visitors were. They were dirty, desperate, and on the run, and one had a broken leg. They fit the profile of the men now known to the whole country as Lincoln's assassins. After dinner, Stewart practically ordered Booth and Harold to leave his home, which they did without protest. Later, Booth would write a letter to Dr. Stewart, chiding him for his lack of Southern hospitality and honor. As an insult, Booth enclosed a small sum of money as a payment for the meal they had eaten, but not enjoyed, at Stewart's. Denied a bed and hospitality for the night, Booth and Harold continued to search for transportation at the house of one of Stewart's neighbors, a man of color named Lucas. Lucas, too, was reluctant to help the strangers. Under protest, he finally agreed to rent them a team of horses and a wagon, with his son Charlie acting as driver for the trip. It took threats of violence by Booth to persuade Lucas to allow the fugitives to stay the night at his cabin. In the morning, Booth paid $20 for the use of the wagon and the team and driver. When they arrived at their destination, Port Conway, young Charlie Lucas stopped the wagon in front of the home of William Rawlins, a farmer and fisherman. There, Booth and Harold quenched their thirst and sought a ride south across the Rappahannock River to Port Royal, then on to a nearby railroad station. The tide was rising, and the fisherman was eager to prepare for the day's catch. He agreed to ferry Booth and Harold across the river as soon as he set his fishing nets. At that moment, 3 mounted figures appeared on a hill just above Port Conway. They were soldiers, and the wagon driven by Charlie Lucas, parked in front of William Rawlins's house, caught their attention. The men spurred their horses and descended into town. Booth and Harold tensed for action. An encounter with soldiers was inevitable. Harold walked toward the riders as they approached, creating distance between them and Booth. The jackets the soldiers wore were not blue of the Union soldiers. A few casual questions, and Harold determined they were Confederates. These were soldiers likely to be sympathetic to their plight. Harold gave the soldiers false names and claimed he and Booth were on their way to join up with the Confederates themselves. He pretended he was an enthusiastic militant Confederate eager to continue to fight the war wherever it was. One of the soldiers, Willie Jett, reacted skeptically to Harold's story and asked a simple question. "Who are you?" Harold replied, his voice trembling, "We are the assassinators of the president. Yonder is J. Wilkes Booth, the man who killed the president." Jett told the other two soldiers, Ruggles and Bainbridge, the exciting news he had just learned. When Rawlins returned from setting his nets, he asked Booth if he was ready to be ferried across the river now. The soldiers huddled their fugitives and hatched a plan. They would accompany the assassins to the ferry boat and help them to the other side. The two men who piloted the men across the river, the strangers, were unremarkable, just another band of bedraggled rebels heading home after losing the war. The successful crossing represented a high point of this phase of the escape. After many disappointments, they had crossed safely south and found loyal Confederate comrades. Overcome with emotion, Booth shouted out, "I am safe in glorious Virginia. Thank God." Willie Jett, Ruggles, and Bainbridge and the fugitives made their way to Locust Hill, a farm owned by Richard H. Garrett. Seeking shelter for the night, Willie introduced himself and presented Booth. "Here is a wounded Confederate soldier, we want you to take care of for a day or so. Will you do it?" Garrett thought of his sons who had returned from the war safely just a few days ago. He would return that blessing with kindness. He agreed to take them in. The soldiers took Harold with him on a ride into nearby town, while Booth spent the night of April 24th at Garrett's farm. Booth spun an unbelievable tale for the Garretts. He had been wounded in battle and was now being chased by the Union cavalry. Until now, most of the investigation and manhunt were focused on Southern Maryland. That was about to change. Lafayette Baker, the notorious detective and War Department agent and a favorite of Stanton's, had been in Washington since April 16th. Since his arrival, his deceitful, egotistical, and self-promoting ways had rubbed a number of the manhunters the wrong way. He had tried to steal other detectives' leads. He was snooping around the telegraph office when a message came in. 2 men had been seen crossing the Potomac. This report required action. Lafayette Baker seized the telegram, rushed back to his office headquarters, and alerted his cousin, Luther Byron Baker, to the news of the sighting. Lafayette said, "I think Booth has crossed the river. I want you to go right out." These 2 men had not been seen crossing the river on April 16th. Yes, 2 men had been seen crossing the river on April 16th, but they were not Booth and Harold. A telegraph order to the commander of the 16th New York Cavalry ordered a commissioned officer, Lieutenant Edward P. Doherty, to report to Luther Byron Baker. Baker handed him freshly printed photographs of 3 men. Doherty did not recognize 2 of them, but the third was John Wilkes Booth. He was going after Lincoln's assassin. This is a picture of Lafayette Baker and his aides planning things. While Colonel Baker stayed in Washington to monitor the telegraph traffic and protect his interests and reward money, Edward Doherty, Luther Baker, and Everton Conger made their way across the water by steamboat, landing in Virginia. From there, the troops traveled south over the land on horseback. If they kept moving, the soldiers of the 16th New York would reach the same spot where the fugitive had crossed the Rappahannock by tomorrow afternoon, April 25th. That evening, John Wilkes Booth enjoyed a leisurely supper with the Garretts. He relished the company and the genuine hospitality so different from Dr. Stewart's impolite, hostile reception. Harold rode into the nearby town of Bowling Green with the Confederates to purchase of all things a new pair of shoes. He would spend the night with them and rejoin Booth tomorrow, April 25th, at Garrett's farm. Booth would sleep in a real bed tonight. It had been days since he'd slept in a proper bed, and this was the first night since the assassination